Hi everyone. I will look at you, but I also look at the camera because we're live on Periscope. So people from Seattle, from Washington D.C., from Los Angeles, from Boston, elsewhere can watch us. Also from China if they're awake, which I think they're probably awake, and whoever is going to be on Whole Ranch channel online so they can watch us live. We are very, very thrilled to have a very, very special guest here with us, Afshin Molavi. I will let my colleague Jason Wong do the introduction of Afshin. He came from Washington, D.C. this morning to give us his thoughts about what's happening in the world and how it is related to our business and our sector, which is the sector of broader education. So we're very thrilled to have him here. So what will happen, let me go through some housekeeping items. Please put your phones on vibrate or turn them off. At the end of his talk, Afshin will open it up for some questions. So you're more than welcome to ask any questions that you have. I encourage you to do so. For our people that are online watching this, I encourage you to use our WeChat channel to type your questions and send it over. We'll read it and we'll make sure Afshin answers it. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague Jason Wong to introduce our today's speaker, Afshin Molavi. Jason?
Hi, my name is Jason Huang, and it's my honor to introduce Mr. Molavi today. Mr. Molavi is based in Washington, D.C. He's the co-director of Emerge 85 and a regular contributor to its online content. Afshin is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Foreign Policy Institute, where he writes broadly on emerging markets, particularly on themes related to the new Silk Road, South-to-South trade, and Global Hub series. Afshin recently published an FPI white paper titled The Pivotal Partnership, outlining UAE-Africa ties as an emerging geo-commercial and geo-economic corridor. Afshin is also a former director of the World Economic Roundtable at the New American Foundation, an ambitious effort to remap the global economy in the wake of the Great Recession. And he currently writes a global affairs column for Newsweek Japan. As a former journalist, his dispatches from West Asia and North Africa and essays have been published in the New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, the Washington Post, Newsweek, Bloomberg View, Bloomberg Business Week, and dozens of academic and specialty publications. So with that, please join me again in welcoming Mr. Afshin Molavi.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's really great to be with you today. This is my very first visit to Pittsburgh, and I think it's a sign of our times that my very first visit to Pittsburgh was at the invitation of a Chinese company operating here in the United States. I've often said that we have, the United States, we are far more globalized than we realize we even are. I mean, from everything from the food we eat to the drinks we drink, the movie theaters that we go to you can find, I did an article a while back for Bloomberg View, and it was a July 4th article, and I listed all the things you may be doing on July 4th, whether it's eating a hot dog or a hamburger and going to the movies and getting in your car, and there was some foreign component. There was a Chinese company, there was a Brazilian company, there was a and then at the end I said, maybe you'll be drinking a Budweiser. What could be more American than that? Of course, but Budweiser is owned by a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate. So we're certainly far more globalized than we think we are. And so I told Ruzbeh I wanted to just have a casual conversation with all of you. I wanted to talk about the things that I'm working on a little bit, but also at any point in the conversation, please interrupt interject and, raise your hand, and I encourage vigorous objections as well as, curious questions. And so why don't we get started? There we go. Okay. So this is an issue that we're all thinking about. Where are we going? Wherever we're going, and I think all of you understand this, we're going there fast. We are living in an era of speed. We're living in an era where 2.5 million bits of content are put onto Facebook every minute of every single day. We're living in an era where 250 hours of YouTube video is uploaded every minute of every single day, So that's a lot of cat videos, of course, but that's also, political videos. It's also businesses, and you better be prepared to be living in this hyper-speed, hyper-connected world, because we're going really fast wherever we're going. Maybe you can show the next one. And so one of the great American boxer, you all know Mike Tyson, right? I call him a great American boxer and philosopher, because Mike Tyson has some wonderful, quotes. And one of his wonderful quotes is that everyone has a plan, of course, until you get punched in the face, right? So we're all going to be punched in the face, in as companies, as individuals, and we have to be resilient, and when those punches come. And this is simply a fact of our era. Maybe the next, yeah. We're living in a world of geopolitical risk. We're living in a world of technology disruption, right? I mean, who could have thought we would be living in a world where, we could be facing driverless cars? I was looking forward to one of the driverless Ubers picking me up. I didn't get lucky on my first effort, but here in Pittsburgh, but on my next, maybe on my way back. But who could have thought we'd be living in a world where, the truck drivers could become obsolete? Right? In the next 15 to 20 years. There are 1.7 million truck drivers in the United States of America. And they could all be out of a job within the next 15 years as driverless car technology progresses. Now that is exciting, but it's also very disorienting and very disruptive. We are headed for a lot of job losses over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And if you thought you saw this anti-globalization mood, which led to the election of Donald Trump, if you thought you saw that as something that was out of the blue, wait till the next 15 years approaches and we start losing more and more jobs to technology. And there's going to be an even more restive mood here in the United States as well, and also in China. Frankly, as there's more automation taking place in China, there's going to be more job losses in China as well. Markets obviously, go up and down, and that's going to be, to continue to be a part of our times. Facebook. How many of you are on Facebook? I know China is not, a place that is regularly on Facebook. Okay, but if Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. Actually, no. Come to think of it. The latest numbers would make it the largest country in the world. So Facebook is I think it's about 1.6 or 1.7 billion users, on Facebook. I know, all of you are on WeChat and Tencent. Yeah, I was amazed. There was an article, if you haven't seen it, it was just in today's New York Times. It was all about WeChat and Alipay, and how Chinese mobile users are using this cashless technology at a rate of 50 times higher than is used in the United States. 50 times higher than at the rate that is used in the United States. So I look at key trends, and I'm looking at the key trends that are shaping the world. Now, some of these trends, you have lived some of these trends. I have lived some of these trends through my travels. I began traveling to the Middle East more than 20 plus years ago. Then I began traveling across Asia. And I think as I was traveling, I was seeing some of these trends play themselves out. And so these are the big trends that I see. And most importantly, I think these trends are disruption-proof trends. And we're always looking for trends that are disruption-proof. And I think these are the 5 key trends that are disruption-proof. So trend number 1, the 85%. Number 2, 129 million per year. Number 3, 1.5 million per week. Number 4, 5 billion. And number 5, under 30. And I'll get into what I mean by all of these. So the 85%, what do I mean by that? Probably no surprise to you, but a surprise to many Americans. 85% of the world lives outside of Northern America and Europe. 85% of the world. We here in the United States are a demographic minority by far, right? So there, often there's this term, the West and the rest, right? Well, the rest is 85% of the world's population, right? So, maybe it's the West and the most. I don't know, but it's we're living in a world that is demographically heavily imbalanced between the quote-unquote West and the rest, and heavily imbalanced toward Asia. We're headed towards a world within the next 5 years where 2 out of 3 people living on the planet will live in Asia, right? So that's what I mean by the 85%. These are the, and it's only going to grow. So I created this lab over at Johns Hopkins University, the School of Advanced International Studies, called the Emerge 85 Lab. And the idea is to look at some of these big trends, rapid urbanization, technological connectivity, physical connectivity, and growing middle classes in the so-called 85 world, right? This is 85% of the world that is the non-West, right? Obviously, there's a wide array of countries, and we're not trying to, put everything into this 85 world catch-all phrase. But I would like to, offer this thought that I think there are some similarities across the emerging world, which we'll talk about. But the only danger I have with this lab, the Emerge 85 lab, is that if we survive another 10 years or so, we may have to call it the Emerge 86 lab or the Emerge 87 lab, because when you look at these population numbers, Africa is going to add another 500 million, Asia is going to add another 600 million people, Europe is shrinking, North America is adding numbers at far lower rates. So this demographic imbalance is only going to increase. So this is, according to UN figures, the way we see the world population numbers right now. No surprise, Asia is the dominant demographic region. But watch for Africa. Africa, which is at about 1.186 billion right now, is headed for 2.5 billion over the next 35 years. I mean, the demographic explosion that we're going to see in Africa is extraordinary. Now, no matter where you stand on the Africa is rising narrative, and I tend to be someone who feels like there has been progress, there's been growing middle classes, increasing connectivity all across Africa, there's new African hub cities forming. But no matter where you stand on that, they are not going to be able to create enough jobs for this young African population. The median age in Africa today is 19. The median age in Europe is 41. Gives you a sense of how young Africa is as a continent. The median age in China, I think, is about 34 or something. It's not one of the younger populations in the world. So that's, headline number 1, 85%. Headline number 2 is 129 million. What do we mean by that? 129 million new urban residents every week. Every week. So if you were to count I'm sorry. This is 129 million. No, it's similar numbers on new urban residents, but we'll get to that. 129 million children born every year. 129 million children born every year. And where are they being born? Africa, Asia, Latin America, right? Predominantly Asia, right? So 129 million children born. If we were to, I had this written down somewhere. Let me think if I can think of it at the top of my head. In the 1 hour that we spend together, there's going to be about 250,000 children born, in the 1 hour we spend together. And in the minute it took me to think about, how many children were going to be born, about 9,000 children will be born, right? So we're living in this world that is really growing. 129 million children being born every single year, all across the emerging world. Where are the 129 million, as we said, right? So this 1.5 million per week, this is the number that I was getting at earlier. This is the number of new urban dwellers every week. Right? We are living in a dramatically urbanized world where 54% of the world's population is urban now. China passed the 50% urbanization mark. As many of you know, in 2012, China will never look back. China will never be a predominantly rural country again. By the year, over the next 15 to 20 years, we're headed for 2 out of 3 people in the world living in cities. Right? So 1.5 million is the number, if you count the number of new urban dwellers from rural to urban migration, and if you count the number of babies being born, we're looking at about 1.5 million per week of new urban dwellers. That's changing everything. And there's a reason that companies like Nestle and Unilever and Starbucks and McDonald's are traveling the world. What they're doing is they're chasing these new urban dwellers, chasing the emerging middle classes, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But cities are extraordinary laboratories of human innovation, but they can also be laboratories of great human tragedy, particularly when cities don't serve the people, particularly when cities don't create the kind of jobs that people think that they should have, and particularly when you have newly urbanized populations. Newly urbanized populations, they go with their backpacks and their suitcases, and in addition to their clothes, and in addition to their shoes, and in addition to their goods, they're carrying a whole lot of hope, right? And when that hope is not met, they become easily radicalized. They become, in a sense, a lumpen proletariat that can be used by radical movements and can be used by political movements, and they become prone to populist movements as well. So this is our urban world, 54% urban, headed for 2/3 urban by the year 2050. In 1950, Africa had 3 cities of 1 million or more. Today, more than 56 cities of 1 million or more in Africa. Watch the Africa urbanization story as well. As Africa increasingly urbanizes, we're going to see much more challenges coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And by the way, the G20 has taken on this issue because they're starting to see it. It's one example where you see government officials actually looking at a long-term issue, and there is a long-term issue with young populations in Africa not being able to have the jobs that they want, and we're going to see the continued migration, from sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, I like the way one official in Kenya told me. He said, everybody says we need, millions of jobs. I see these young people as millions of opportunities. Sure, absolutely, I do too, but you still have to create the jobs for them. So 1.5 million per week. Rural to urban. Cities are the economic engines, right? There was a McKinsey study that was done a few years ago that showed that 600 cities account for about 2/3 of global GDP, right? There is a great emerging markets investor by the name of Arif Naqvi, the founder and chairman of the Abraj Group. They invest in emerging markets around the world. One of the things he likes to say is, if you ask me what I think about Indonesia, I tell you I'm not so sure about Indonesia, but I sure do like Jakarta, right? I like Jakarta, and his point is that Jakarta is about 1/4 of Indonesia's GDP. Right? Seoul is about half of South Korea's GDP, right? So cities are the real economic engines. And it's not just in the emerging world. It's here in the United States as well. So you take a city like Los Angeles, if you were to take the Los Angeles metropolitan area, you're looking at about an $860 billion economy. The Los Angeles metropolitan area, would be a G20 country. Just the Los Angeles metropolitan area. It has a GDP that is roughly equal to Turkey's, right? It has a GDP that is larger than the GDP of the Netherlands. a GDP that is larger than the GDP of oil-rich Saudi Arabia. You know, so just the Los Angeles, you know, metropolitan area, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Anaheim. So this gives you a sense of the power of cities as economic engines, but the power of cities as economic engines not just in the emerging world, right, but also here in the United States. So we're here in Pittsburgh. So, you know, I looked up, you know, the Pittsburgh GDP, and so Pittsburgh's GDP is larger than the GDP of Kuwait, right? You know, Pittsburgh has a GDP, it's larger than, you know, Hungary, you know, which is a Central and Eastern European emerging market, you know. It's larger than Ecuador, Morocco, Ukraine, right? This is the power of cities. This is the power of the U.S. economy as well. So I spent a lot of time talking about the quote-unquote the rest, right, the emerging world. And I'm broadly bullish on the emerging world because of rapid urbanization and growing middle classes and technological connectivity and physical connectivity. And each time I go to China, I'm amazed at what I'm seeing. And each time I go, you know, to other parts of the emerging world, I'm amazed at what I'm seeing. You know, but don't count out the United States as a center of innovation, as a place with some of the best research universities in the world, as a place with the most liquid and deep capital markets in the world, as a place where, you know, entire cities equal GDPs of major economies. And just to go on this theme as well, if you were to take New York and LA, you know, Lanny or Nyla, if you whichever one you want to call it, the combined GDP of New York and Los Angeles is larger than the GDP of India, right? It's larger than the GDP of France. So don't count out, you know, the United States. Don't count out the power of cities as well as powerful economic engines. So this is a particularly important one, and I think for your mission as well. 5 billion by the year 2030. What do I mean by that? There are 3 billion people in the global middle class today. 3 billion. And these are figures that we're all indebted to Homi Kharas at the Brookings Institution, who's spent the past decade studying trends in the global middle class. So I'm borrowing from his figures here. He says by the year 2030, we're looking at 5 billion entering the global middle class. Obviously, you know, some of the biggest leaps have taken place in China. Right? You know, we've seen transformational leaps in China. But 5 billion by the year 2030, this goes back to what, if we combine all of these together, we're talking about urbanization, young populations, technological connectivity. Again, there's a reason why Adidas and Unilever and Nestle and Procter & Gamble and all of these companies are chasing this emerging middle class, because these are big numbers. And these are young people with buying power. This global middle class is reshaping trade patterns. It's reshaping countries. It's reshaping the way firms do business. I think it's reshaping every industry. It's, you know, reshaping your industry as well, the education industry. Because one of the things we've learned as middle classes grow is they want education. They demand better education. They seek private education as well when they can. And we're seeing it all across the emerging world. The global middle class is shifting. It's, again, the shift is more towards Asia. You know, according to some estimates, we could have a world in which, you know, 2/3 of the global middle class, 2/3 of the percentage of the global middle class is in Asia by the year 2030. And finally, the fifth key trend is under 30. We're living in a very young world. You know, more than 50% of the world's population is under 30, but particularly in the emerging world that we described, and particularly in Africa, particularly in some Asian countries. China's not one of the, you know, countries that is, you know, considered young around the world, but certainly sub-Saharan Africa, certainly many Middle East countries, where you have populations in which 50% are under the age of 21. You know, 50% under the age of 18. So we have a very young population, young populations that are growing and dynamic and becoming consumers. And $56 trillion of consumer spending by the year 2030. According to Euromonitor, a lot of that is middle class spending. And then the single biggest transformation, I think, personal transformation, of course, is the smartphone, right? I mean, think about the smartphone for a second. You know, you all have smartphones in your pockets, right? We've gone from 0 smartphones in 2007 to, you know, we're headed for 6 billion of them by 2021. From 0 to 6 billion in less than 15 years. The smartphone has the same computing capacity that NASA had to send a man to the moon in the late 1960s, right? So, and that's in our pockets, you know. And all of you know this far better than I. I mean, you know, those of us in America, we're primitive when it comes to smartphone usage compared to China, right? I mean, you know, you're paying for everything on your smartphones. You're moving much faster towards a cashless, you know, society, certainly in the urban centers, than the United States is. And so the smartphone is not only a technology disruptor, not only is it a commercial disruptor, it's also a geopolitical disruptor as well. And I think that's something we should talk about as well. Let me move through this. Another, I think, transformation we're living in. We talk about technological connectivity a lot. We don't spend as much time talking about physical connectivity, although a friend of ours, friend of Rusbe and ours, Parag Khanna, has written an excellent book called Connectography, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it. But he does talk a lot about physical connectivity. But the physical connectivity is also transforming our lives. And think about it in this way. If you were a member of India's middle class, right? And you know, if you lived 25, 30 years ago, it would have been very unremarkable for you to live your entire life without ever getting on an airplane. Now it is totally remarkable if you never get on an airplane and you're a member of India's middle class. Indians' middle class are 9 times more likely to travel today than they were just 20, 25 years ago, travel by plane. The air travel revolution has hit Asia, as you all know. And you can buy an Air Asia ticket in a vending machine in Singapore or in Kuala Lumpur, you know, and travel, you know, across Southeast Asia on, you know, budget carriers. And we're also seeing emerging market carriers challenge the big legacy carriers. You know, so you've all seen the rise of Emirates Airline and Qatar Airways and Etihad Airways. And that hasn't gone over all that well here in the United States, as you may know, because what these airlines are doing is they are becoming the long-haul carriers of choice for many Americans who travel to Asia, right? They're not flying these to stay in Dubai, though some are. They're not flying these to stay in Abu Dhabi or in Doha. They're flying these airlines to connect to Asia. And you know, that was always almost the de facto monopoly of United and American and Lufthansa and some of the European carriers. So this was, you know, these Gulf airlines have totally disrupted global commercial aviation. Totally disrupted. And the next wave is going to be, you know, potentially Chinese carriers. And so we're living in this, you know, air travel revolution. The other thing is there's a lot of good news in our world today. It's hard to imagine given how much bad news we see in the news, but we have lifted, you know, at least 1 billion people from poverty since the early 1990s, right? So in the early 1990s, 1 in 2 people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Today it's about 1 in 6 in the world. I highly recommend another book by Stephen Radelais, Georgetown University development economist, and he lays out all these statistics. I mean, we're living in a world where girls have access to education in ways that they have never had access to education before. All we have to do is look at the China transformation, which, as Evan Osnos wrote in his book, The Age of Ambition, has been at about 10 times the scale and 100 times the speed of the Industrial Revolution that transformed England, right? So we're living in a world where there's been a lot of good news. Rising middle classes, increasing technological connectivity, increasing physical connectivity, the growth of a new middle class, right? So what could go wrong, of course, right? that are exciting if you are Unilever or Nestle, or if you're an education company. They are also challenging if you're a government. And they're challenging if you're a government because if we just take this one example, this man, his name is Mohamed Bouazizi. Mohamed Bouazizi was a Tunisian vegetable vendor and fruit seller who got up every day and sold his vegetables and fruits from his stand in a city called Sidi Bouzid. And he was providing for 4 brothers and sisters and his mother and father from the proceeds of his vegetable stall. Mohamed Bouazizi was operating in what academic economists call the informal economy. Right? Mohamed Bouazizi didn't have a chance to get higher education. He was making his living this way. And for the Mohamed Bouazizis of the world, their interaction with government is not the Davos, state. It's not finance ministers and foreign ministers. It is predatory local officials, right? And predatory local officials are present all across the emerging world, right? And predatory local official came to him one day and said, "You don't have the right permit. You can't sell your fruits and vegetables here." And Mohamed Bouazizi was left without a livelihood. So what did he do that day? He went to the municipal building. And when he went to the municipal building, he demanded his license back. And they said, "You can't have your license back," because Mohamed Bouazizi had neither bakhshish, which is Arabic for bribe, nor wasta, which is Arabic for connections. And so he couldn't get his license back. And when he stepped out of that municipal building that day, he didn't say, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." He didn't say, "Long live freedom, death to the dictator." He said, "How am I supposed to make a living?" Because for all of the, some of the statistics I laid out for you, there's still a lot of people that are left behind. There's still a lot of Mohamed Bouazizis operating in the informal economy, just every single day eking out a living. And this is the case all across the emerging world. And Mohamed Bouazizi an hour later showed up at that same municipal building with a canister of gasoline, poured gasoline on himself, and lit himself on fire. And it was that act that sparked, in many ways, the uprisings in Tunisia, which sparked the uprisings in the rest of the Arab world, which changed and transformed the entire region, right? That one act. Right? And how did that happen? Well, it happened partly because of some of the trends that I was describing earlier, some of those positive trajectory trends. Well, the young men who went out and protested when they were throwing rocks as a result of Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation, they had a rock in one hand and they had their smartphone in the other. And they were taking video images of the confrontations with police officers. And they were uploading those video images onto Twitter and onto Facebook and onto YouTube. And television producers working for Al Jazeera Television in Doha, Qatar, were picking up those images. And they were transmitting them on Al Jazeera Television. And the Tunisian revolutionaries who participated in that event, they told me that it was when their images were displayed on Al Jazeera is when they felt that they had arrived, right? It was one thing to be on Twitter, another thing to be on Facebook and YouTube, and 'cause after all, everyone can be on Facebook and YouTube, but not everyone can be on traditional TV. And they said that they really felt that their voice had been heard. 2 to 3 weeks later, the Tunisian autocrat president Zeinab Ben Ali stepped down. And it was an extraordinary moment. It was an extraordinary moment for the Middle East, and it was an extraordinary moment for technology. It was an extraordinary moment for growing middle classes because Tunisia also had a growing middle class. Tunisia was very wired. Tunisia also had a pretty robust civil society, one of the more robust civil societies in the region. And so this led to uprisings in Egypt, which led to uprisings in Yemen, in Bahrain, and other places all across the region. And 5 or 6 years on, it certainly doesn't feel like spring. This term, the Arab Spring, it doesn't feel like spring in Damascus. It doesn't feel like spring in Yemen. It doesn't feel like spring in Libya. But we've had this extraordinary disruption, and it felt a little bit like what Vladimir Ilyich Lenin once said, that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and suddenly weeks pass and months pass and decades happen. It certainly felt that way at that time, but I think I prefer a quote from Antonio Gramsci. I think, and I think it's very appropriate to the Middle East, but also appropriate to our times, where he said that the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. And in the interregnum, the morbid symptoms appear. All across the world, we're seeing old structures dying, new ones not yet being born, morbid symptoms appearing and filling those vacuums. And so for all of the good news that I described of the urbanization and the growing middle classes and people being lifted from poverty and access to education for girls and access to education for boys as well, there is still this underside, and I think we're going to be facing it as well. And let me just close on this note of aspiration, because I think one of the greatest changes that has come to our world is this sheer ability for people to aspire in ways that are meaningful. So, right, 30, 40, 50 years ago in many countries around the world, you couldn't really aspire meaningfully. And by that I mean you could hope for a better life, but you didn't expect it, right? Now it is totally unremarkable for the daughter of an Egyptian taxi driver, for the son of a Kenyan farmer, for Chinese young people to aspire in meaningful ways and entirely expect that their aspirations will come true if they work hard or if they get an education. This is a transformation in our world, because in many ways there was an aspiration gap. It was the West where people aspired meaningfully, right? Now you see aspiration taking place, all across the emerging world, and people expecting their aspirations to be met. Now, as a result, and I think what has happened is, and I'd love to get all of your opinions on this. I'll close with this. I'd love to get all of your thoughts on this. If you've seen that lately they've been doing these polls, Pew Research does this poll where they ask people around the world, how satisfied are you with the direction of your country? Do you think your children will be better off than you, right? And what is striking is there is an optimism in the emerging world, in China, in India, in Philippines, in Nigeria, when people answer that question. And there's a pessimism in the Western world when people answer that question. My children will not be better off than me, say 2/3 of French and 2/3 of Germans and almost 2/3 of Americans. My children will be better off than me, say Nigerians and Filipinos and Indians and Chinese. How is your country moving in the right direction? Again, majorities say yes across the emerging world. Majorities say, slight majorities say no across the Western world. So we've seen this hope gap flipped as well. And I think that is partly helps explain some of the populism that we're seeing in Western countries. But I think it's just a very interesting and dynamic time that we're living in. It's a transformative time we're living in. I can certainly go on and on in this vein, but I do want to have a conversation, so why don't I leave it here? And I really thank you for your time and attention. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me put this
Sure.
over here. This was a fascinating talk. You usually give talks at various forums in UAE or in Asia to investment bankers and to others where there are investing, for the most part, financial capital. Our business is a little bit different.
Right.
We are investing or helping parents to invest in the future, which they care much more than financial capital, which is their kids.
Right.
You closed your talk by talking about the generation of aspiration and thinking about how, in a way, if we're looking at the United States, if we're looking at the student population, our domestic populations are growing more pessimistic, whereas the non-U.S. student population that are coming over, mainly from China and elsewhere, they are growing more optimistic. Our team members constantly and directly talk to students, talk to their family. What do you? What are the key points that you want them to keep in mind to not only be part of, but be a really active part of this generation of aspiration, and try to put all this political noise, all this economic noise and social noise aside, and really pay attention to that signal?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it's, one of the things I've been teaching a class this past spring semester over at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and one of the things that we often hear about is millennials here in the United States, and there's a lot of complaining about millennials, and oh, they don't work hard and they're entitled and all of this, and I haven't found that to be the case. I find that they do work really hard, and because they understand that they have to, right? We're living in a world where 20 to 25 years ago, some jobs that exist today didn't even exist 20 to 25 years ago. So I think that the thing that I would tell them, is first of all, constantly be prepared to learn new things, right? Someone once said that I like learned people, right? Learned people are fine, but I like learners even more. People that are constantly willing to learn new things, constantly willing to adapt, because in this world, with the way it's moving, with speed and connectivity, you have no choice but to be an adapter. You have no choice but to build up your resilience. You have no choice but to constantly learn new things. And it's actually, I find it more intellectually gratifying to get out of your comfort zone a little bit and constantly learn new things. And then if I were to say to the ones who are coming to the United States, I would remind them of the extraordinary, economic potential here in the United States, but I think they get it right away when they're here. It's often, what I'm often struck by is when I see immigrants first come to the United States. As someone who grew up in the United States, though of immigrant parents, I find that I didn't have the quote unquote immigrant hustle. That some, newly arrived migrants would have. They would arrive. I had family members who would arrive from Iran, and within a year they'd figure out how to get a small business loan. They'd figure out how to, maximize, or game the system, to their advantage. And they were so amazed at all of the opportunities and resources available to them. And I think that when they come here, they'll see that. Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I think the first comment that you made is this is your first visit to Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And how long have you been in Washington, D.C. area?
Oh, I've been in the Washington, D.C. area.
We don't want to try to get
exactly.
your age,
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm in my mid-40s, so I've been there almost, a little over 40 years.
Over 40.
Yeah.
40.
Yeah.
This is really telling that you've been roughly around within a 200 miles radius of Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And the first time, so you've been there for 4 decades. That
Yes.
means you have seen a lot has happened in the U.S. in Northeast.
That's
but
right.
Your first visit to Pittsburgh
Yes.
is by invitation of a company that has nothing to do with steel, has nothing to do with Carnegie Mellon, and has nothing to do with healthcare. So this is very telling about the world that we're living in and the direction that we're taking.
Very telling. And just one other point on that is that not only do we not realize how globalized we are in the United States, but globalization has also gotten a really, a bad rap in terms of how, we've lost a lot more jobs here in Pittsburgh to automation than we have to globalization, right? And if you think about the how important international trade is to the United States, how important export industries are to the United States, there was a Department of Commerce study that said there are 20 million jobs directly related to foreign direct investment in the United States and export industries in the United States. 20 million jobs. If any president came forward and said, I can create 20 million jobs, he'd be president for life, you know. But 20 million jobs have been created because of globalization. Now, I understand there's always going to be winners and losers, you know, in any economic system. But it's up to the government to, you know, create, you know, safety valves and for those winners and losers. But I think that we've gone too far. The pendulum has swung too far against globalization here in the United States.
That's interesting. Well, with that, let's open it up to a few questions, and then we're gonna wrap it up. Afshin will be with us tomorrow for a very, very short, brief time, so we can also interact with him. So, open it up. Any questions? Any comments?
I think we're over there. There's some.
Anyone?
Okay, I can. Okay, as an international educational recruiting agency, so let's just do a little brainstorming. What's the odds you can see there that we can recruit 10 boys from a poverty, undereducated, ISIS-occupied area in Iraq? What's the odds you can see there?
You know, I think if the odds are that if the U.S. would give them visas, right, the parents in those places would send their boys en masse, right? You know, one of the things, and the other things that I've noticed is there's, you know, don't stand in the way of a mother or a father, but particularly a mother, who wants to educate his or her child, you know. And increasingly all across the emerging world, we need a new term for that. Increasingly all across the world, but particularly in the 85 world that I describe, this is widely seen as the ticket out, right? You get an education. This is your ticket out from poverty, you know, from underdevelopment, and there was a private school in Kenya that opened a few years ago, and the fees were low. They weren't very high, but they still had to pay fees. And they were amazed at the long lines of people signing up for that private school, particularly from people who couldn't really afford it, you know. But they were taking out loans, they were borrowing money, they were doing whatever they could to sign up for that private school. And you see this across India as well. Private education, you know, is booming because the schools are not good. So I guess, you know, the answer is they will come if you can get them the visas. But that's the hard part.
Well, let's not speak in the visa part, not speak in their willing, like what's the odds we can, let's say just what's the odds we can bring these 10 boys to the Ivy League college? To
Ivy League colleges, yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think it would, you know, depend on their educational achievement, you know, in high school. And I think that but you know, there would be a certain exoticism, certainly, if you grew up in that kind of environment and you achieved, you know, and you know, you apply for an Ivy League school. But again, that gets into admissions issues that I'm not really, you know, that familiar with. But there's been plenty of examples of people like that who've gotten into, you know, you know what? After this, I'm going to put you in touch with a wonderful group of Syrian American activists who do just this, and their role is to find high-achieving Syrians living in Syria, living in difficult conditions, help them with their college applications, help them with letters of reference, and help them get into some of the elite universities in the United States, and they have been successful. So I'm glad you brought this up, because I'm going to put you in touch with them, and they would know a lot more about this than I. And the name of their foundation that they work with is called the Karam Foundation, K-A-R-A-M. And some of the people around that Karam Foundation split off and created this other organization that does just this.
Good. I'll go in order. So Jason and then.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Mr. Alavi, you added on the point that about this emerging market in the 85 world, and the countries, the parents,
yes,
with growing aspirations. So and this is especially in China. That's the market that we serve particularly. And I was wondering, in what ways has the U.S. Changed or developed in order to serve that market better?
You know, the United States still has enormous attraction for people across the emerging world, because it's still the best, universities in the world are in the United States, and I think that one of the things that happens is, particularly in this political climate we're living in here in the U.S., we can get very pessimistic about the United States, we can get down on the United States, but again, when you've got some of the best, universities in the world, institutions are strong. You've got some of the most innovative companies in the world. You've got companies whose market caps would make them G20 countries. A company like Apple, a company like Facebook and Microsoft. These companies have market capitalizations that are larger than the GDPs of 75% of the world's countries. And so I think people get that. I think it becomes, in some intellectual quarters, it's very fashionable to bash the United States, but those same people that are bashing the United States are sending their sons and daughters to the United States. And so I think people get that. And look, what are the numbers of Chinese students in the United States?
300,000.
How many? 300,000. Yeah. Over 100,000 Saudi students. In the United States as well. The King Abdullah Scholarship Program, probably one of the most significant scholarship programs in the history of these kind of scholarship programs, has sent 100,000 Saudis to study in the United States. And by the way, on that King Abdullah Scholarship Program, you could choose from a lot of different countries, right? And this gives you a sense of the power of the United States to attract students, because I think there's about 140,000 Saudis on this King Abdullah Scholarship Program, and there's about 100,000 of them who chose the United States over other countries that they could have chosen to go to.
Well, great. I mean, that's why Jason and I made a team. I have roughly the same question that Jason has, because we feel really lucky that having Afshin said all that, we are serving the emerging middle class and emerging new multinationals pod. So Jason kind of asked about the advantages those target clients could get out of. And actually, there's a third group that we are serving that are the educator leaders from the higher institutes in China. So, I mean, with all this trend we're talking about, China only has 2 top universities that's ranked in among top 100 in the U.S. News rankings. So those educators are also trying to learn from the U.S. education system, like in terms of like education leadership and teaching skills, and how do we inspire those young people, things like that. So what are the values you see for them, for the educators of the emerging leaders to get the values out of United States through education?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important for those education leaders to come to the United States, particularly the ones that are in the technology and the sciences, because there's so much cutting edge research here. But just the mere act of interacting, with their fellow administrators, fellow educators, and I also think that I would love to see more South-South, educational exchanges, because when I alluded to this earlier, that there is this kind of, 85 world kinship, so to speak, and this is a working theory that I have, but I think that in many societies and many countries in the so-called emerging world, they're dealing with some similar things. They're dealing with the transition, between the transition of urbanization. In many of these societies, they're dealing with modernity and tradition, and the battle between modernity and tradition. they're dealing with women's empowerment issues, and that's new in many of these societies. And so they have these similar, and I wrote an article about Turkish soap operas and why they are so popular in Latin America of all places. And the reason they were popular in Latin America is because, it was a good story and interesting and riveting stories. But the Latin American women that were interviewed who were watching these Turkish soap operas said that they saw their own lives in these Turkish women, And how is it that an Argentine or a Brazilian, or a Peruvian could see their own lives in a Turkish woman, other than the fact that there is this kind of emerging world kinship, of modernity and tradition. So I think that the more you have these kind of educational interactions, from a U.S. perspective, great, but also South-South. And the reason I bring this up is because you can come to a U.S. university and you can engage with them, and they might not quite get your context, and they might not get your society and where you come from, and they might say, oh yeah, this is how we do it and this is how it should be done, without realizing all of the challenges that educator in China faces, that educator in India faces, that educator in other parts of the emerging world faces. Whereas if you go to a fellow emerging world country, right, they will understand some of those challenges. So I think but you also mentioned emerging market multinationals,
right?
Because I think there's a whole world of a new market out there as well for executive education for these emerging market multinationals as they begin to globalize, because they need to understand their competitors, right? Their competitors at the airlines and their competitors at the technology firms are all going and doing executive education courses, and I think this is another area of growth business potentially for Holren. Yeah.
You talk about emerging 85 and the West and the rest. Are the trend going to be changed? Are there going to be a chase flip, or are those emerging 85 just going to grow to 85, 86, 90, but they are never going to surpass UK and US, because they just say aside from economics and political stuff, say the schools, Princeton and Cambridge, Harvard. From my experience, I can never think of such a university can reside in India or China in the short term, because that's a factor of time.
Yes.
So what's your view?
I think you're right. It takes a real long time, to build, those kind of universities. It also requires a cultural context as well, to build, to around that university, whether it is a tradition of innovation, a tradition of entrepreneurship, a tradition of free inquiry, which you don't always see in many parts of the emerging world, right? And so it certainly does take time. And I don't know, have things changed? I can tell you, that in many, again, emerging world countries, not to paint too broad a brush, but if you were to say to your mother or father that I want to be an entrepreneur, they would say, sit down and be an engineer, or go study to be a doctor. But that maybe has changed in places like China. I don't know. How about a show of hands? If you were to, let's say, how do I frame this question? Would you have pushback against your parents if you said you wanted to do a technology startup? No? Okay, good. Well, that's a good sign. It's the Jack Ma effect then, and I think that's important. So that spirit of innovation, spirit of entrepreneurship is vital, and when that comes. Then you need the spirit of free inquiry. Then you need the private sector to partner with universities. I mean, these universities are University Inc. now. In the United States, these are not just centers of learning. They've become, centers where, the private sector funds research. They become centers where the government funds research. And I think this last point is worth noting, because we often think about, when we think about the United States, we think that this, is a place that was built on free markets, right? Yeah, to some extent, yes, but it's also built on government funding for research, government protection for companies, government protection for industries, right? Infant industries were protected in the United States for many years. It was only and by the way, infant industries were protected in China, and they're continuing to be protected in China. Japan would not be where it is today if they didn't protect their industries. So government plays a very powerful role in all of this. It's when you get to a certain level and your industries begin to dominate that you push everybody to open up their markets, for free markets, right? And then once they start challenging you, as the Gulf carriers did with the U.S. carriers, then you run to your government and you say we need protection, But no, this is a government. This needs to be something that is done by government. And I'd like to ask you, do you see the kind of the elements in place in terms of government funding for research in Chinese universities, private sector synergies with universities and investing in research? Are you seeing these kind of things happening in China now?
Oh yes.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot quicker than that in the U.S.
Okay. A lot quicker than in the U.S. Okay. All right. Good. So we'll those are key ingredients to the mix, if that's happening.
Can take one or two more questions. Anyone?
Right.
Okay. If you have any other questions, we can ask Mr. Molavi tomorrow when he's here in the morning at our office. First of all, thank you very much.
Thank
a big
you.
round of applause
Thank
to
you.
Afshin.
Thank you very much.
So
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank
time.
you. Thank you.
And I have seen Afshin giving speeches again, majority of it to investment bankers, but I think this is the best investment you have made.
That's right.
Because you will see it not just in the portfolios,
Yes.
not in terms of rate of
That's
returns.
right.
You will certainly see it in terms of what the students, what this growing populations, on one side students, on one side their parents, but what you called it this aspiration.
Yeah.
And you know what I was going to say, based on this, our business should be the business of aspiration rather than education. Then I realized I'm wrong, because one of the companies Dr. White and Andrew put together is called Aspire Pathway.
Oh,
so
very good. There you go.
There is an aspiration element. So they have seen it that way. But it is really wonderful to have you here. And we really hope we can interact with you more, but also we really hope we can use what you have told us from a 30,000 feet, that when we're talking to parents, when we're talking to educators, when we're talking to students, because our constituency is a wide range of constituency. One of the questions I had for one of my teammates is how can we do, in a way, living room diplomacy? One of the biggest markets we're looking at, I think it's going to be a growing market, is homestay.
Yes.
We have a lot of exchanges in the age of populism, in the age of where countries are, because of geopolitical events, are trying to whether build walls or in a way isolate themselves. What can we do to open up living rooms? And I think that's vitally important. And if we're looking at President Xi Jinping's today and his closest relationship with a very, very middle-class American from Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, that's a very telling story.
Yeah.
So in a way, we're in the business of diplomacy as well.
You are,
but
absolutely.
with a bit of inspiration for this generation that's focusing on aspiration. So we really hope we can take advantage of this and apply it to what we're doing in our industry. We cannot thank you enough for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.